Okay guys, I didn't want to do this, but you asked for it. Again and again and again. And who am I to deny you? So let's go. After our last 5 videos on Mary Sue's, there's still one question you guys just can't leave alone. Is the high ground a Mary Sue? A Mary Sue is an overpowered and perfectly good character with no explanation given for that power level. A Mary Sue is typically instantly liked by all the established characters, yet at the same time, a Mary Sue doesn't have much of an actual personality. Mary Sues are also instantly liked by all the established characters for no apparent reason. And for this reason, Mary Sues feel like a wish fulfillment fantasy more than they feel like actual characters in the story. Finally, being perfectly good and overpowered, typical Mary Sues are also never embarrassed and never fail in important ways, which is one reason Mary Sues are typically considered bad screenwriting. So, let's find out if the high ground is a Mary Sue. First, we'll look at whether high ground is overpowered. High ground's power level has been recognized for thousands of years. In Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which was written in the 5th century BC, the author gives the pro tip that when the enemy occupies the high ground, do not confront him. High ground is so buff that its power level is relevant on all levels of battle, from army-wide engagements to one-on-one duels. So high ground clearly has a power level that's pretty swole. Let's look at some examples of the high ground being overpowered. In 218 BC, Hannibal, one of the greatest generals in history, tried to use his mighty war elephants against the high ground, but to no avail. Many of the elephants froze to death, and the high ground wasn't even dented. Not only did all of his elephants die, except one, half his army also froze to death while engaging the high ground, and Hannibal himself was blinded in one eye. Hannibal also tried to attack the high ground with fire, but again, that didn't have much of an effect. So in the end, he decided that the high ground was too tough for him to take on, and descended into Italy to fight the Romans instead. The Romans had the most brutal, efficient, and merciless military machine at the time, but they were clearly less of a threat than the high ground. Next, in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan with 700,000 men, missiles, tanks, planes, and attack helicopters. All looked lost for the Afghans until they retreated to the high ground, where they hid and conducted hit-and-run attacks, which eventually forced a stalemate and Soviet withdrawal. That's right. A global military empire with tanks and nuclear missiles couldn't beat a bunch of scruffy-looking nerf herders as long as they had the high ground. That clearly shows that high ground is overpowered. Finally, at the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederate infantry was broadly agreed to be more experienced and battle-hardened than their Union counterparts. General Lee made the decision to charge the Union line while the Union held the high ground and lost 9,000 men over the course of a couple of hours, completely decimating his army and forcing a retreat. Again, this shows that high ground is overpowered, and not just overpowered, insanely overpowered. Sun Tzu said that you shouldn't attack an enemy when he holds the high ground, and Lee didn't listen. Do you know who else didn't listen?
It's over, Anakin. I have the high ground. You underestimate my power.
Next, we'll look at whether high ground's power level is unexplained. This is not really the case, since projectiles of all kinds are easier to aim downwards than upwards. Also, in terms of sword fighting, the amount of energy required to attack is greatly reduced with a downward motion due to the assistance of gravity. Since the majority of sword-based movements are made below the shoulder, the amount of energy required to strike a target, which holds the high ground, is increased. Conversely, the opponent holding the high ground swings lower with the aid of gravity, enabling strikes at critical areas like the torso, arms, neck, and head. So while the high ground may be overpowered, high ground's power level is explained. It's the gravity, stupid. Now, let's look at whether high ground is perfectly good. At first glance, we might be tempted to conclude that the high ground is just neutral, since it doesn't speak much and it's hard to discern its motivations. High ground also often seems to help both sides in a fight, or rather, to help whoever is nearer to it, suggesting again that high ground may be neutral. But if you think about it, age-old wisdom has something important to teach us about the ethical habitus of high ground. Without thinking about it, many of us refer to high ground as good, such as when we speak of holding the moral high ground. When we speak of someone who holds the moral high ground, we mean someone who is principled and upholds standards of justice and goodness. Deferring to age-old wisdom, then, we therefore conclude that the high ground can be said to be perfectly good.
Don't try it. Oh.
Now, let's look at whether the high ground has a personality then. Here I would say, not really, since high ground doesn't show much of a definitive character, even when all other parties give it a time to shine. At the Battle of Austerlitz, for example, both parties knew that getting high ground on their side would be the key to winning the battle. But even though it was first held by the French, then the Allies, and then the French, then the Allies, then the French again, high ground didn't really demonstrate much of a personality. High ground just kind of sat there, passively helping whoever was closest to it. It felt very much like high ground just let itself be defined by whoever was around it, without showcasing any character traits of its own. And for that reason, it's hard for us to get a sense of what high ground is really like, apart from all the other characters telling us that high ground is powerful, cool, and desirable. We therefore conclude that high ground doesn't have a personality. We also have to answer the question of whether the high ground is instantly liked for no apparent reason. Here, the answer is mixed. The high ground is clearly liked by almost everyone, and the high ground doesn't have to do much to earn their infatuation. Everyone just kind of rushes to the high ground and wants to be with it. When armies set up for battle, both sides usually try to get as much of high ground as possible, even though they haven't spoken with high ground and haven't given other terrain types a chance. So we can clearly conclude that high ground is instantly liked. But as we've seen, it's not for no apparent reason. As my coworker told me when he explained why he preferred two 19-year-old interns to one aged 36, gravity always wins.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
I'll try spinning. That's a good trick.
High ground!
Does high ground feel like a wish fulfillment fantasy then? A wish fulfillment is like a daydream where the typical frustrations of life are turned on their head. Someone who's not very beautiful, rich, powerful, or well-liked experiences a fantasy where they have all these qualities in abundance. At first glance, we might say that high ground isn't rich, though it certainly is powerful and well-liked. High ground can also be pretty beautiful when it sets its mind to it, although that isn't always the case. However, be that as it may, the clearest example of high ground feeling like a wish fulfillment isn't found in what high ground itself does, but rather in how other parties try to emulate it. For example, when people build strongholds such as castles and fortresses, they're usually accompanied by towers and high walls to make them seem more like high ground. That clearly shows that the other characters want to be like high ground and wish they were more like high ground. Likewise in Star Wars, the Empire is fond of using walkers, even in spite of their obvious vulnerabilities. This is clearly because they feel more like high ground. In fact, they could be said to be a sort of mobile high ground. So if we look at how the other characters relate to high ground, they clearly wish they were high ground. making high ground count as an example of a wish fulfillment fantasy.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
You underestimate my power!
Don't try it!
Finally, we have to look at the question of whether the high ground is ever embarrassed or fails. Throughout its 1,000-year history, we note that high ground has generally performed extremely well and been on the winning side of most conflicts. And even when high ground has lost, it hasn't exactly been humiliated. Like Sand, it certainly hasn't had an arm or leg cut off. But the question isn't whether high ground wins most of the time. The question, in relation to the Mary Sue Index, is whether high ground has ever been embarrassed or failed. Here we can see that at the Battle of Jeting, which took place in 228 AD, even though the Shu Han forces had the high ground, their enemies, the Xiao Wei, still won by surrounding them and cutting them off from their water supplies and reinforcements. So the high ground has failed at some point in its history. And also, the high ground was, of course, embarrassed in the Phantom Menace.
It's over, Obi-Wan! I have the high ground!
Thus, tallying up the score, high ground gets 5.5 out of 7 on the Mary Sue Index. 2 points for being insanely overpowered, 1 for being perfectly good, 1 for having no personality, and 1 for feeling like a wish fulfillment. High ground also gets half a point for being instantly liked, although not for no apparent reason. That leaves high ground's total Mary Sue score at 78.6%. Which, although it can't quite match Rey's, is still pretty Mary Sue-ish. And that's why, although high ground cannot be said to be a perfect Mary Sue, high ground is clearly in the Mary Sue ballpark.